This is an enormous group. Some have traveled very far to get here, from Vancouver, Portland, Stockholm. So let me introduce everyone here. This is Robert Arell, who's currently the head organizer of Exit in Sweden. Has worked there for 20 years, yeah? And was the first person to really sort of open that door to me. And he's now working with Life After Hate to develop bring the Exit program here into the United States. Sammy Rangel, now you've seen all these guys in the movies, right? Sammy Rangel is one of the co-founders of Life After Hate as well. And from Racine, Wisconsin, Tony McAleer from Vancouver, one of the founders, CEO and director now of Life After Hate. Kathy Lee is Distinguished Professor of Sociology, and you're a dean now, is that right? Yeah. She's a dean at University of Pittsburgh, and probably the foremost researcher on women in the hate movement in the country. She's written several books about it, and they're really quite impressive. And were some of the first things I read as I began to think about gender in the movement. Randy Blazak, who you saw in the movie as well, from Portland, professor at Portland State for many years, has worked in prisons with Aryan Brotherhood, and has also been working with some of the guys from Life After Hate. Film star Frankie Mink, who, and I'm hoping that one of the questions that I'm prompting to ask you will be about some of the stuff that you do about contact, about sort of engaging guys to meet each other. Frankie, you saw in the film, Philadelphian, now works largely in Des Moines, yes, and runs a program called Harmony Through Hockey, which is really quite impressive. Guys play hockey, different groups of kids from different backgrounds, and through their playing sports together actually begin to sort of have that kind of contact with the other that enables them to break down some of those stereotypes. And finally, but not at all, last is Oren Siegel, who's the director of the Violent Extremism Project at the Anti-Defamation League, and is good. And I've asked to moderate this panel because I will back away from this. And ask them some questions. Oren has worked in this area for many years and knows some of these guys pretty well, and has been working with government about these issues. So Oren, I'm going to hand this one to you. You guys can pass this around, and there's one more there that you can use as well.
Thank you. Appreciate it. My job is essentially to ask a couple of questions and to stay the hell out of it, okay, for these guys to speak. But I do want to say something up front. At ADL, our Center on Extremism, every day we try to understand these movements, how they reach, radicalize, and recruit. And I think we're in a moment in time where we're seeing that this activity is on a rise. We're in a particular moment in time. But I would say what makes me hopeful is not so much the hate that we see now on a daily basis on TV, on our phones, everywhere that we look. This time will be remembered for what people did about it. And so I just want to say it's an honor and a privilege for me to be on this panel with you, because these are people who are actually doing something about it. So I'm just going to... That was my job, to just warm them up. Okay. So why don't we start with Robert first. I think what people want to hear in the audience, based on what we just saw, is this sort of concept of authenticity and finding meaning in a group. I know that you had experiences in military, and that you sought out the military in part because of the movement that you were involved with. Could you tell us, just sort of a little bit about your story, but how military may provide meaning in the way that groups can provide meaning on a different scale?
Sure. So first of all, well, thanks for inviting me, and great to be here, Michael. Well done. We've been waiting for this book for a long time, so well done. And to just share my personal experiences, when I went into the movement, it was clearly seeking identity and belonging and all the benefits of joining these type of groups that individuals gain. Whereas in the movement, learning more about the ideology and shaping my mind, it became very clear that a great part of it is to get military training. So to get training to be prepared for the coming revolution. And in Sweden, as I did my military training, I was in a period where I was doubting a lot of the qualities of my friends in the movement. I wanted something more. I saw us, if we were to take the next step, we would need some type of other type of quality. And in military, I think what happened was a lot of different things at the same time. I think first of all, I really felt a sense of competence, belonging, a lot of strength. I was a fairly good soldier. But it also became very clear that I wasn't really sure that I was going to go back to my friends after military. I think these two factors together, with external factors that changed a lot of my perception of where I want to go in my life, what am I prepared to do, and what gives meaning for me, really helped to make the decision. And it didn't come overnight. This is processes that starts and it takes time to grow. And even when I was out from military, I wasn't sure or clear where to go or what was right and wrong, but it was the start of this period. So I think for me, military really was a way to get out from the movement, to gain a sense of competence and self-esteem, and to build new social relations, which I think was key to really start over.
Thank you. Sammy, so I'll ask a question, you'll pivot to whatever you want, obviously.
Great.
But you know, in addition to expressing a bit about sort of your path, one of the things that struck me in the film is we're talking about people who have already sort of made that jump. Are there any applications to the work that you're doing in Life After Hate that can identify mitigation points prior to people sort of joining that group or that movement?
So in a sense, prevention, is that what you're getting at?
Yeah.
So I think, treating people like human beings as a parent, as a school institution, as community, goes a long way for prevention. I think Robert kind of reveals a point about a group giving him meaning, but then finding more meaning in something else, and then are willing to kind of transfer from one sense of belonging to another. And I think what we witnessed here with Thomas and Randy is that we're trying to help foster this idea that there is more meaning and more value than what they would have anticipated living this way now. And when you can make a business case like that, whether it's a young person, maybe before they get into it, or who's contemplating or deep in it, when you can, one, treat them like human beings and embrace their humanity and come from a place of non-judgment, a place of willing to listen and support, it has, as you see, it has a powerful impact and effect on people.
Absolutely. Tony, I was struck in the film by sort of the compassion that you were talking about. And it seems like today there's ebbs and flows in the movement in terms of who's getting involved. Some of who we saw were a little bit older, but there's a whole generation of even younger people that seem to be getting involved because of social media, etc. Look no further than Charlottesville, where the lasting image that people have are, kids in khaki pants, polo shirts that, look like the guys who are your accountants or pizza delivery guy or teacher. Is it different to try to show compassion to somebody who's a little bit older than somebody who is younger and still sort of developing? What is the challenge in terms of compassion for this set of people versus a younger set?
I think we need to have compassion for everybody, you know, is the simple answer to that. But, you know, one of the letters we received right after Charlottesville was a letter from a mother who said, my son's 18, he's got Asperger's syndrome, and he's found this online community of white nationalists, and what really scares me is they have embraced and accepted my son in a way that no one in his life ever has. And you know what that speaks to, number one, you know, Michael, talk to the guy about ideology, you're right, it's not going to do anything, but I think, you know, the talk of compassion has to come even before in terms of prevention. How do we as a society treat those, especially younger people who may be a little bit, a bit different? And you know, I'm a big believer that shame is the underlying driver for all of it. So as a society, you know, I think we have to look at the younger people, and in my belief, the antidote to shame is it's compassion. And so it has to be for older, but we have to be more compassionate with the younger people.
I just want to follow up real quick. Do you think that there are sort of younger people who are better maybe suited to try to get other younger people out of the movement, or does the age of the person who is engaging in sort of that removal process, is that significant or not?
Oh, definitely, it's significant. The more we can be like the person we're trying to help, the more they can identify with us. That certainly is that common factor. But you know, there's this younger sort of generation, you know, the alt-right that we're seeing, that they're not like the thugs and the skinheads that, you know, that was our time. These kids are often mild spectrum autism. They're very bright. They're very tech savvy. You know, they're almost like nerds, and I kind of refer to them as Revenge of the Nerds. And they're gamers, and they eat in weird places that wouldn't even think about when I was young. They're not really physically capable of violence, but their violence is all online. It's a very different phenomenon, and we have to recognize that it is different, and we have to show them compassion nonetheless, and we do have to engage young people to help us do that.
Thank you. I'm going to skip to Frank, and then I'll get to our educators. So I was prompted to ask you a question about the connections that you're making between folks. So if you could tell us a bit about that, and also a little bit more about your path.
You know, what I've done, and Sammy's gone with me, and what I've done before is I've gotten people together who are actually meet on the same level. A guy breaks up with his girlfriend, is a white nationalist kid, and I get him to hang out with a former gang member who's black in Grand Rapids who also just broke up with his girlfriend. Like two guys that just broke up with their girlfriend. No one else gets along. You know what I mean? It's like the dads with daughters. Dads with daughters get along so well because your teenage daughter, at one time you were the smartest person, now you're like the dumbest person on the planet. You know what I mean? So you have empathy for each other, right? So when you can make them connections between people, because empathy, as we all talk about, is such a huge component to anyone changing the world. For me not to hate you, if I know that you went through the same pain I did, if your father was an alcoholic and my father was an alcoholic, I don't give a shit what. I don't care what color you are. We're going to talk, you know. If we talk, I might share something with you I never share with anybody in the world. Because you know. You know what it's like when mom said, don't drink again, he's coming home drunk, you better go hide. Nobody else in the world knows that pain. I might even laugh about some of the stories. Man, my dad passed out drunk one time naked. My friends were sleeping around the back. And I never said no, I never said that story to anyone else. But this black kid used to tell me his dad was an alcoholic. And one time my dad fell asleep outside naked. And we laughed about it. And probably our whole life, I always thought of that moment in a horrible, wretched way. And for now, I'm finally releasing it and sharing it with somebody. So, I mean, that just works easy. Sports is the easier part. I mean, you know, people have to, it's a real innovative program you came up with. I got kids freaking have fun. You know, if they want to have fun, that's what they want to do. Kids don't hate much, you know. Dennis Leary said, kids hate one thing, naps. They don't hate other people. So it's easy to see them play together. That's not a genius for that.
So even with what Frankie was saying, Frankie has spoken at ADL audiences throughout the country for many years. Kathleen, a lot of what we're hearing about are connectors between men. But we know that there are women in these movements. What are they finding that is attractive to them? What is it about these movements that's speaking to them specifically? And also in terms of getting them out, does that also require something different than what we're already hearing?
So I agree with Michael that the gender nature of these movements is really key. But how it works for women is different in a way. So if women get pulled into these movements for gendered reasons. So one of them is that this is promised that you could be a woman warrior. So it's like a woman's empowerment kind of message. Another is that this is going to be like your family. It's going to be a really tight group, and they're going to be better than your real family, and more loving and more of a community. And another is the whole culture, like you're in this world and the music and the culture and it's this whole experience. But the interesting thing for women is that all those are all attractions, and they're all revealed to be fraudulent very quickly. So the women I've interviewed in the movement and the women who are in and who have left, even if they stay for a while, they become disillusioned very quickly because the whole woman warrior thing isn't true, and it's very clearly not true as they find that they're abused and belittled and certainly kept out of any kind of leadership position in the movement. The whole family, it's going to be like a family, is very quickly revealed to be fraudulent as the men really have the power and the women are serving them. And the culture that attracts them also becomes repellent to some women very quickly, especially the violence that's based in the culture. So for women, it's interesting, sort of what pulls them in is also what pushes them out. So the gender is very important for women, but it operates very differently.
And last but not least, Randy, so you've done work studying gangs and in prison. And we heard in the film that you said that sort of you have more captive audience in prison, where somebody can't just go home and maybe have access to other ideas, so you're maybe more, for various reasons, more inclined to try to find like-minded extremist groups or hate groups. Can you talk about some of the research that you've done?
Yeah, this is, as the traditional hate groups in America have kind of declined, like the Klan and the skinheads and the various neo-Nazi groups. So it's been growing as these groups inside prisons, and it's a product of our mass incarceration. We're throwing a lot of people in prison. We're throwing a lot of people of color in prison, especially on lower-level drug charges. But because of these mandatory minimum sentences, we're also throwing a lot of white first offenders in prison. They show up, they're not affiliated with anybody, and they see all these gangs that they've known, whether it's Latino gangs or black gangs, and all your favorite gangs are there, and they're looking at you like a fresh piece of meat on your first day, and somebody comes up to you, maybe with a swastika tattoo, and says, hey, we will protect you. And then you say, no, I don't want to have anything to do with you guys. I'm not racist. I don't, why would I hang out with Nazis? And I say, okay, you're on your own. And then, they go into the battlefield, and then very quickly they go back to that guy with the swastika and say, what can you do to protect me? Nothing in prison is free. Everything comes with strings attached. They call it the credit system. And so for that protection, I must pay a price. And that price sometimes is inside. I want you to go over there and stab that brown guy in the neck just to show that you're loyal and paying back for the protection. Some of it is on the outside. You're only in for a 2-year bid, so when you're on the outside, here's what I want you to do. And if you don't do it when you come back, you're in trouble. So there is this huge problem. I mention this because I'm involved in a murder trial in Portland right now of a member of a white supremacist gang, who I shouldn't mention, who killed an African-American teenager just outside of Portland, who just got out of prison, and was sort of one of these scenarios where was he in the prison group while he was outside of prison? Well, it turns out, he still had an affiliation. He was showing his tattoo, and he actually had a little hat and the gang's insignia. So this is a growing problem. The Jasper, Texas dragging murder, which is now 20 years ago, was connected to this kind of dynamic. And we had the head of the Department of Corrections in Colorado was shot on his doorstep by a member of a racist prison gang who's paying back prison debt. So this is a part of a dynamic. And there's a gender component. I don't want us to lose the gender component in all this. And there's a term that's this past year, I can't believe how much I'm hearing, which is this notion of toxic masculinity. We were just a small gang of us a few years ago were talking about toxic masculinity, and now you're hearing it on CNN. In prison, there is the most toxic of toxic masculinity practice because you have to survive. You are always at war. Even when you sleep, you have to be ready to battle. You can't trust anyone. It's highly predatory. And so one of the issues that we deal with who work with this community is how do you change that mindset when those people walk out of prison? Because it's not like you just turn it off. Your mind is still kind of incarcerated when you walk on the outside. So one of the things I want to point out very quickly is these people don't join these groups because they're racist. They become racist after they join the groups.
You know, one of the themes we're hearing too is about sort of alienation, whether it's automation, social changes. Somebody told me that in 32 states, the most popular occupation is driving. I don't know if that's true. I didn't check it, so it's not fake news or whatever, but it sounds possible. Truck drivers, Uber drivers, cab drivers. And I'm thinking, self-driving cars are on the horizon. And what happens to these people who may not have skills to apply elsewhere, right? They may get more attracted to various causes, movements, etc. What are you seeing? This is sort of for everybody in terms of sort of the current state of the changing culture and society. What are the key elements that you find that are driving people to these movements, perhaps in ways that we haven't seen 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago? Anyway.
Can I just, since I have a microphone in my hand, I'm a sociologist. So when I started I've been interviewing white supremacists officially for 30 years. I've really been doing it all my life. I grew up in a Klan town in Georgia, so I started probably when I was 8 years old doing this work. And one of the things that was really clear early on, 30 years ago, was the change in the economy, the move towards deindustrialization, people moving away from the factory, and that has just accelerated. So there's a sociological term called anomie, the sense of normlessness. There is this feeling that the world is getting away from the people who used to be at the top of the heap. And so that chant that you heard in Charlottesville, "You will not replace us," is really at the underpinning of the
Jews will not replace us.
Yeah, and then that's the next line, Jews will not replace us. Because there's a direct line to "you will not replace us, Jews will not replace us to make America great again." Right? When is that again in that phrase? And CNN finally asked the candidate Trump, when is again, and because I think they were hoping he wasn't going to say 1863, but he very clearly said early 1950s, right? So that's a lot of change between then and now. A lot of things have happened since then, including the feminist movement, the gay rights movement, the ableist movement, all these things that have displaced those white men who feel like their picture of the world is going away. And so that's the challenge of what we respond to not allow those men to fall into that world.
Yeah, I mean, as reformers, you're not going to solve the problem of self-driving cars or the change that we're experiencing. So how do you relate with somebody and provide them with an alternative to the concerns that they have about this?
I learned a valuable lesson when I'm not just a former, by the way. I'm a father, for a master's degree. I'm an educator, therapist, spiritual counselor. I represent a lot of formers who are much more than just their past, right? One of the lessons I learned when I was privileged to be a part of a planning stage and an implementation of a reentry program in Wisconsin was that there was research coming back to show how the systems that were in place to manage incarcerated people were actually contributing to recidivism rates, and in a very powerful way. And so we had to go after systemic change. We can apply that logic to what we're talking about right now. While we could talk about what is wrong with the far right, the violent far right, what I see as one of the major contributing factors to why we aren't getting traction much quicker is because for lack of a better term, let's say people who are on the left or who agree with the left have become intolerant. And so that intolerance is very similar to the same value that's in place coming from the far right, this idea of intolerance, that we can't stand these people, we want nothing to do with these people. And so people who have maintained the moral high ground as it pertains to civil rights are now starting to become frustrated with that approach. People are getting tired of this sense that we have to turn the other cheek, and that what we've been doing for the last 50 years is losing traction, and we've lost traction, and so they abandoned this path. And so now you have two sides who are intolerant to even have dialogue, to even be in the same space. And I'm not making the false comparison that was made after Charlottesville about the far left or the alt-left, which is a misnomer and complete false comparison when only 2% of violent extremism in the last 2 years has come from the far left. The problem that we're having is that we have lost our ability to maintain poise, patience, persistence, and our protests start to fall apart and unfocused. And so I think in many ways we have to revisit lessons learned from the civil rights movement from before, where people were willing to stay the course, stay the cause, and maintain their moral high ground as it pertains to, again, to wanting to social justice in that sense, right? And so we have to be willing to listen. A lot of times we're being asked, what would you say? And it has more to do with what we should be doing, which we have to open the channels for listening. That listening doesn't mean, but it's often misinterpreted for conceding, but without listening, we can't understand. And at the same time, we don't have to condemn while we're not conceding, but we've gotten into this perpetual pattern of condemning people that we can't identify with or relate to in any way, shape, or form. So we have to take some ownership for what we're not doing as a society to make the efforts that we all are applying here across the spectrum more successful than they could be.
Can I follow up just a second? I agree with what Sammy's saying, and I think it's important that we don't think about the people you're talking about as so different from us. So when you're suggesting, well, it's going to be people who are losing their jobs because they're drivers, that's not really the totality of people who go into white supremacists. There's plenty of people who are from middle class, upper middle class backgrounds. So it's not just people who are economically marginal or sort of slipping off. It's people who feel threatened maybe psychologically or in their status, but not necessarily people who are very different from us, right, in many ways.
Yeah, with regards to that, I think you're absolutely right, and it's, while we can understand the feelings that these people have, we don't accept at all the conclusions that they're experiencing and who they blame as a result of that. And in Alberta, when the price of oil dropped from $100 down to $50, within a year, the suicide rate went up 30%. So that, take the ideologies aside, that kind of rapid economic dislocation, and that was all levels. The white men, and it was mostly white men running the rigs, were offing themselves in record numbers. And I think Princeton's got a couple of studies which just show that it's almost an epidemic, and that right now white men in this country are actually got a lowering mortality rate. They're the only population with the mortality rate going backwards. And so we have to understand that.
That's a good point.
So we have to understand that, whether they have these feelings, the conclusions are wrong, but they have these feelings, we need to understand that. And I think where the frustration comes with compassion is it's so easily misunderstood. And for compassion to work, we have to have healthy boundaries and consequences. Now, we often give that job of healthy boundaries and consequences to law enforcement and different things, but when we don't have healthy boundaries and consequences with compassion, it becomes an invitation for abuse. People don't respect it on its own. But we, as a society, need to hold people accountable for their actions. We can still have compassion, but hold them accountable. And everyone at Life After Hate, I know we hold each other and ourselves. I hold myself accountable. I do this work as a way of making up for what I've done and holding myself accountable. And we just have to remember to accompany that. When it's combined with healthy boundaries and consequences, compassion is an incredibly powerful thing.
And the problem with that is what you see happening in Charlottesville. I'm going to tell you, I've been at them rallies where I was on the other side, where I was holding the neo-Nazi banners, holding the neo-Nazi flag, walking, and people would, Westchester, Pennsylvania, snowed the day before a grand rally, which was a bad idea because all the protesters had snowballs. So there was this big snowball fight. It was horrible. But, I mean, people were pelting us with stuff, and I say this all the time, I never was holding a banner and dumped a bottle from somebody and went, whoa, I better rethink my beliefs here. You know, I never once thought that, ever. I always thought, there's my enemy, he's right there in front of me, and I'm with my crew, I'm with my guys, and there's my enemy, he just threw a bottle on my head. Like, that doesn't work, that doesn't make, you're not smashing racism by punching a redneck in the face for rally. You're just punching a redneck in the face, right? I mean, it's really not smashing racism in any way, shape, or form. You're just furthering things along, really. But once someone talked to me and treated me as a human being, it was so hard for me to fight that. It was so hard for me to hate that person who just shared something with me that was, like I said, their soul. You can't hate, so.
Just want to follow up on that point. I think that's one of the crucial aspects here. When we talk about people joining these groups, most people don't want to engage in a dialogue and understand and try to see the perspective, but most people want to tell them that they're wrong. You're wrong, you shouldn't do this, this is not the way to go. Instead of listening, understanding, and trying to see from that person's perspective, what's the gain, and how can I use that understanding to give other perspectives. So I think that's one of the challenges that we have in society with this very polarized debate climate.
So Michael opened up by saying that the Life After Hate basically got their funding cut with the current administration. And ADL put out a study recently that looked at the past 10 years of extremist-related violence in this country. We found that 76% of extremist-related murders were carried out by right-wing extremists, 24 by Islamists or jihadists or whatever the nomenclature is at that moment, and then 2% was left-wing. So to me, one of the takeaways that I hope you all have is that statistic. 76% of extremist-related murders in this country have been carried out by right-wing extremists, and yet the focus tends to be on those who are foreign terrorist organizations. So as we wrap this up, to be respectful of people's time, I want to give each one of you an opportunity to express to this audience what's that one takeaway that you want people to have about the work that you're doing, the time that we're living in, or what's on your mind. Let's start at Andrew Roberts.
That's a challenge. That's a challenge. We're trying to talk about it. And the solution is?
You've been up there for a half hour.
I mean, this is.
How about a takeaway, not the takeaway?
Okay, sure, super. A takeaway. Well, I think only one takeaway. I mean, honoring the work of Michael, I would really want to put in the perspective of thinking of gender roles. So how do we also put in? I think Sweden, where I come from, is supposed to be one of the more gender equal countries. But we still have quite a lot of challenges and work to do. So I think if we want to have young men solving conflicts and problems without aggression and violence, we could also think of learning already from the beginning. How do we deal with differences, challenges, stress, conflicts in other ways than what these groups promote? I think that could be a small takeaway.
You talked about the funding. Life After Hate, right after Charlottesville, the press picked up the cut in the funding again. People connected the dots to what happened in Charlottesville, the shift in the paradigm from the far right, very narrow focus. Not that we shouldn't be focused on both, but not solely, if you ask me. This country rallied behind us, and we've raised over $800,000 since Charlottesville. So we've doubled the money. And then just a few weeks after we got the announcement that the funding was pulled from us, the United Nations reached out to Life After Hate and gave us a humanitarian award for our efforts combating violent extremism in the U.S. I met a man who, a young boy, 20 years old, whose family was German. His great-grandparents were Germans, and they were asked to hide and protect a Jewish family with 2 children who were scheduled to be executed the next day by a German constable. And that German family hid that Jewish family for 2 years. And that young man said, I don't know what I would have done if I was my great-grandparents, but what my great-grandparents showed me is what is possible. I think Life After Hate is an example of what is possible. I think the work that Mr. Kimmel and everyone on this panel is doing is an example of what is possible. I think that $800,000 by 15 or 20,000 donors shows what is possible. This isn't a hopeless situation, although we'd like to frame it as such. And so I think that for the audience getting behind movies like what Peter has put together to help spread this message, that's possible. The We Counter Hate project that we're doing on Twitter, inserting ourselves in the same spaces where these hate messages are popping up, that's possible. It takes creativity, but it also takes great endurance. And we're only as strong as the communities that support us.
I think it's important to remember that we all have a role to play. It's easy to think that it's a piece of legislation or a grant that we're going to get or a presidential decree, or that we have to wait for Oprah to be president before we solve this problem. It's up to each of us as human beings to be more compassionate in our everyday life. And this is a challenge I give to people, is try and do an act of kindness or compassion for someone who you don't feel deserves it. And notice how that makes you feel. And notice how it makes them feel. It's an incredibly powerful experience. But I think it's not in these grand events, it's in every action of every day that we do that real change happens. I mean, when I think about, in Vancouver, I'm not sure about here, but they have kale salad at McDonald's. Kale salad. Now how does kale salad get into McDonald's? It's the decision that everybody makes when they put a morsel of food into their mouths, that's what they want, and that's how we make that change. It's millions of tiny little things, not waiting for someone else to do a grand thing.
Thank you. Kathleen beat kale salad.
I would say that my takeaway is that this is an incredibly multidimensional problem, and maybe with how people get in and how they stay and how they get out and the prison connection. And one of the things that I think is most hopeful and effective is that people who are studying from different angles are working together. So Keith, Cindy, and I are doing a research project, and we've been privileged to work with Life After Hate on the research project. And I think all those kind of connections between academics and activists and people working on different aspects is really the direction that we need to go.
Wow. Well, I think on the dark side, obviously, the last year and a half, we've seen the extreme right emboldened. I wish I had $1 for every time I've used that word in the past year and a half. On the bright side is there's an incredible amount of resistance, including among young people. This generation, the post-millennials that we're seeing in Florida right now are incredibly hopeful. And I always try to say that there's sort of 3 ways we work on this issue. We work on an institutional level, what in our laws and our systems and our universities and our business places can we change? We work on a cultural level. What can we do in our neighborhood to bring people together, to break down those barriers? But maybe most important, what we do on a personal level. How we confront our own internalized white supremacy, our own internalized sexism, our own internalized ableism, homophobia, and all those things that are inside us, so we don't look like hypocrites when we're out there talking to these people, because the extremists can sniff that hypocrite a mile away. They'll say, oh, you say you're anti-racism, but I just saw you say Merry Christmas, so, you know, something like that. And I don't want to go down that road, right? Merry Christmas. Is it over yet? Move on. And so I think the challenge really is, you know, ultimately on ourselves, and I think others will pick up on that when we see that we are on that path. I'm still on this path. I've been doing this work, you know, for a long, long time. But I don't say I'm not a racist. I am an anti-racist, but I don't say I'm not a racist. I'm still working on my racism. And I think if we want to kind of convince the younger generation that this is a struggle, but it's a lifelong struggle, but it's worth it because you get to come to New York, you get to do great things and eat kale salad if you want it, and life is much better. Because the big question, and this might come from your book, Frank, is, you know, when you ask someone who's in the world of hate, what has that choice done to make your life better? Is that you? Did I steal that from you? And I've had that conversation with people since I read your book and asked them, and they often say, you know, I really can't name anything. And I say, well, come over to our side, because besides kale salad, we got great music and great people, and we'd love to have you on board.
So, to classify who I think I was, yeah, I think I was. I was an egomaniac with no self-esteem. That's kind of what makes a thug, a criminal. I mean, we're all kind of that same makeup. You go to juvenile detention centers, and we'll work in them, or I've worked in them, and a kid will come back for a second time, right around Christmas. And I'll say, what are you doing here? Why are you back in juvie? Punch a kid in the mouth. Why? Because he disrespected me. What did he do? Oh, he tried on my sneaker. I mean, it can be as minor as that. And so you punched him in the mouth, now you're back in here, your mom's visiting you on Christmas, but he disrespected you. Yeah. Because I didn't know how to react if I felt disrespected, real or imaginary. I could imaginarily heard that you might have said something about me at a party someplace, and now we're going to, you know, have revenge. So, because my ego didn't know how to handle it, because I had no self-esteem. So when I started to become more active in trying to be a better human being, I picked up little slogans and little things, but one of the ones that always stuck with me was, there was these really tough guys in my dad's neighborhood. I mean, guys would carjack him in a second. They all hung at my dad's bar. And I used to think they were so tough and so hard. They had jails, they had prison stories. Other guys and kids that I was friends with, their dads didn't have any prison. They were boring. They asked about schoolwork. Those guys were awesome. But then I thought they were the hard guys and the other guys weren't. But then as I got older, I realized that the real hard guys were the guys that were home with their kids asking me about my schoolwork. Real hard guys don't act hard. You just are. When the occasion comes when you stand up for what's right in the next person, you stand up for somebody else. So, not to brag a little bit, but I'm a 7-time national championship hockey coach. That's what I do. I coach kids to play hockey. But when your kid first joins my team, 2 things I ask them. First is, what position do you play? Very soon as they make the team, hey, what position do you play? And their moms will tell me, oh, he's a winger. Johnny's going to NHL. He's already working in contracts. He's 8 years old. You know? So, okay. And I say, a winger. And then when we get outside, get onto the floor, and they made the team, I say, so all you guys who told me what your position was, you all answered it wrong. And I'll say, who's been on my team before? Okay. I ask you a question. What position do you play? Wherever you want me, coach. Wherever the team needs me. That's what I'll play. And what I teach every kid that joins my team is, and anyone I know and all people, is humility. And humility is so, if I can not think less of myself, but think about myself less, and put others in front of me, it makes the greatest teammate, the greatest hockey player, you know, to stick with the world and the team. So I used to go into hockey right away, but it makes the greatest just partner and teammate. That I don't think less of myself, but I think about myself less. So if we can train people to live that way, I try to be more humble, or try to have more humility and make the world a better place. If my wife can love me a little bit more than she did yesterday, I'm doing okay.
Thank you all, and we hope that everybody here will be our teammates in some shape or fashion soon. So Michael, thank you. Peter, thank you. And Cora,
I just wanted to say thank you again to this amazing group, and to all of you. You didn't expect such a substantive book party, did you? Right? But I also just want to say very quickly before we close, events like this don't happen by themselves. I have an amazing staff at the Center for the Study of Men and Masculinity. You can see they're already getting ready, packing things up. But I just want us to all thank them because they are the ones who... So I hope that you are as inspired as I am by these stories. I felt like that they were the stories I wanted to tell in the book, the stories not only of the people but the organizations that they have founded and work in. Because I find this, I find especially in this era, an era of dramatic rise, as Randy says, emboldened. You know, the extreme right in this country, that this is the place where I go to for hope in the future. So thank you all for coming.